When I told my stepmom, she can never replace my mom. She convinced my dad to throw me out, but I got my revenge on her and my dad and had them thrown out instead. I, 19F, lost my mom to cancer when I was 14. It was devastating. Mom was my best friend, my rock. We did everything together: baking, gardening, weekend trips. She taught me to be strong, independent, and to always stand up for myself. Losing her left a huge hole in my life. Mom's battle with cancer was long and hard. She was first diagnosed when I was 10, and for a while, it seemed like she might beat it. We had good days where she felt strong enough to take me to the park or help me with homework. But there were also bad days, filled with hospital visits and the sound of her getting sick in the bathroom. Through it all, she never lost her spirit. Even on her worst days, she'd find a way to make me laugh or tell me how much she loved me. Dad, 45mm, was there too, but he was always more distant. He worked long hours at his law firm, saying he needed to make sure we had enough money for Mom's treatments. Looking back, I think he was just scared and didn't know how to handle the situation. He'd come home late, kiss Mom on the forehead, and retreat to his study with a glass of whiskey. When Mom passed, it felt like our family fell apart. Dad buried himself in work even more. I was left to navigate my grief alone. I'd come home from school to an empty house, make myself dinner, and cry myself to sleep. Dad and I barely spoke beyond necessary conversations about school or household chores. This went on for about 2 years. Then, out of the blue, Dad introduced me to Caroline, 38F. They'd met at a work function and had been dating for a few months. I was shocked. I hadn't even realized Dad was seeing anyone. Caroline seemed nice enough at first, but I was wary. It felt too soon, like Dad was trying to replace Mom. They got married 6 months later in a small ceremony. I put on a brave face for Dad's sake, but inside I was a mess of conflicting emotions. Part of me was glad to see Dad happy again, but another part felt like he was betraying Mom's memory. From the start, Caroline tried too hard to be my new mom. She was always hovering, trying to give advice, wanting to do mother-daughter activities. It felt forced and made me uncomfortable. I made it clear I wanted space, but she didn't listen. Things came to a head last month. I was home from college for the weekend. Caroline cornered me in the kitchen, saying we needed to talk about our relationship. She went on about how she'd been trying so hard to connect with me, how she loved me like her own daughter, and how hurt she was that I kept pushing her away. I'd had enough. I told her bluntly that she needed to back off, that she could never replace my mom, would never be as important to me, and needed to stop trying to force a relationship that wasn't there. I said I appreciated her making my dad happy, but that didn't mean I had to see her as my mother. Caroline burst into tears and ran to my dad. He came storming in, furious. He yelled at me for being ungrateful and hurting Caroline's feelings. I tried to explain my side, but he wouldn't listen. He told me I needed to apologize immediately or face consequences. I refused. Dad then dropped the bomb. He was cutting off my college tuition. He said if I couldn't appreciate my family, I didn't deserve their support. I was shocked. My mom had left money specifically for my education, but apparently Dad had control over it. I called my maternal grandparents in tears. They were outraged. Turns out Mom had set up a trust for my college funds that Dad wasn't supposed to touch. They promised to look into it and told me not to worry. My grandparents had always been a big part of my life, especially after Mom died. They lived a few hours away, so I didn't see them as often as I'd like, but we talked on the phone regularly. They were the ones who kept Mom's memory alive, telling me stories about her childhood and reminding me how much she loved me. A week after the blow-up with Caroline, I got an eviction notice from Dad. He was kicking me out of the house, saying I was no longer welcome if I couldn't respect the family. I was devastated. How could he choose his new wife over his own daughter? My grandparents stepped in. They hired a lawyer and discovered Dad had been mismanaging Mom's estate. He'd used money from my college fund for house renovations and to buy Caroline expensive gifts. It was all illegal. As we dug deeper, we uncovered more. Dad had been dipping into the trust fund almost since Mom died. At first, it was small amounts, a few $100s here and there. But after he met Caroline, the withdrawals got bigger. He'd bought her a car, taken her on lavish vacations, all with money that was meant for my future. Long story short, we took Dad to court. The judge ruled in our favor. Dad and Caroline were ordered to move out of the house, which was actually left to me in Mom's will, and repay all the money they'd taken. My grandparents became my legal guardians and took control of my trust. The court proceedings were brutal. Dad tried to paint me as an ungrateful, rebellious teenager who was jealous of his new relationship. But the evidence was clear. When the judge announced her decision, I saw something in Dad's eyes I'd never seen before. Defeat. Now Dad and Caroline are living in a small apartment, struggling financially. They keep trying to contact me, saying they're sorry and want to make amends. But I'm done. I'm back in college, living in the house during breaks, and finally feeling like I can breathe again. Some friends say I went too far, that I should forgive Dad and try to rebuild our relationship. But I don't think I can ever trust him again. He chose his new wife over me and tried to ruin my future. Am I the asshole for cutting them off completely? Update 1. It's been about 3 months since my last post, and a lot has happened. First, thank you all for your support and advice. It really helped me feel less alone during this difficult time. After the court ruling, Dad and Caroline moved out of the house. It was a surreal experience, watching them pack up their things while I stood there with my grandparents. Dad tried to talk to me one last time, but I couldn't bring myself to say anything. The hurt was still too raw. As they were leaving, I noticed Dad lingering in front of the family photos on the wall. There was one of him, Mom and me at the beach when I was about 8. It was taken a few months before Mom's diagnosis. We all looked so happy, so unaware of what was coming. For a moment, I saw a flicker of the Dad I used to know, the one who would give me piggyback rides and read me bedtime stories. But then Caroline called his name, and the moment was gone. Living in the house alone during college breaks was strange at first. It's a big place for just one person, and everywhere I looked, there were memories of Mom, and unfortunately, of Dad and Caroline too. I decided to redecorate, to make it feel more like my own space. My grandparents helped me pick out new furniture and paint colors. It was therapeutic, like I was reclaiming the home that should have been mine all along. As I was going through old things in the attic, I found a box of Mom's journals. Reading them has been both heartbreaking and healing. She wrote about her hopes and fears, her love for me and Dad, and her thoughts on what our lives might be like after. She was gone. In one entry, she specifically mentioned hoping Dad would find happiness again, but also expressed concern that he might try to replace her too quickly. It was like she knew what would happen. About a month after they moved out, I started receiving daily calls and messages from Dad and Caroline. At first, I ignored them, but they became more persistent, leaving long voicemails about how sorry they were, how they wanted to make things right. Caroline even sent a handwritten letter, apologizing for trying to replace my mom and promising to respect my boundaries if I gave her another chance. I'll admit, part of me was tempted to hear them out. Despite everything, Dad was still my father. But every time I considered it, I remembered how easily he had cast me aside for Caroline, how he had tried to steal my future. The trust was broken, perhaps irreparably. My grandparents have been my rocks through all of this. They've taken me in, emotionally and legally. We've grown so much closer. Grandma tells me stories about Mom that I've never heard before, and Grandpa's been teaching me how to manage my finances. It's bittersweet. I wish I had this relationship with them while Mom was still alive, but I'm grateful for it now. I've also been reconnecting with Mom's side of the family. Aunts, uncles, cousins. I hadn't seen much since Mom passed and Dad remarried. They've all been incredibly supportive. It's like I'm rediscovering a part of myself that was lost when Mom died. My Aunt Sarah, Mom's younger sister, has been especially helpful. She's only 10 years older than me, and we've developed a close bond. She's been sharing stories about Mom from when they were growing up, filling in gaps in my knowledge of who Mom was before she became a mother. It's helping me feel connected to Mom in a new way. As for college, I'm back full-time and doing well. The trust my mom left is more than enough to cover my expenses. I've even started therapy to work through my grief and the recent trauma with Dad and Caroline. It's helping, slowly but surely. Dad and Caroline's financial situation has gotten worse, from what I've heard through family grapevine. Dad lost his job. Apparently, the scandal with misusing my trust fund didn't sit well with his employers. Caroline's been picking up extra shifts at her job to make ends meet. Part of me feels guilty, but then I remind myself that they brought this on themselves. I'm still struggling with whether I made the right choice in cutting them off completely. Some days I'm angry and want nothing to do with them. Other days, I miss the Dad I used to have, before Mom died and everything changed. But for now, I'm focusing on healing and building a life for myself. Maybe someday I'll be ready to consider letting them back in, but that day isn't today. Update 2. It's been almost a year since my original post, and I wanted to give you all a final update. So much has changed, yet in many ways, things have settled into a new normal. I graduated college last month. It was a bittersweet moment. I was proud of my accomplishment, but sad that Mom wasn't there to see it. My grandparents and extended family came to the ceremony. Dad and Caroline weren't invited, and honestly, I was relieved they didn't try to show up uninvited. The graduation ceremony itself was emotional. As I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, I thought about how Mom had always stressed the importance of education. She'd talk about how her own mother, my grandmother, had to drop out of high school to help support her family. Mom was the first in her family to go to college, and she was determined that I would have that opportunity. 2. Knowing that I'd fulfilled that dream for her, despite all the obstacles, felt like a tribute to her memory. Speaking of Dad and Caroline, they finally stopped trying to contact me. The last message I got from them was about 4 months ago. A brief email from Dad saying he respected my decision and would leave me alone, but that he'd always be there if I ever wanted to reconnect. I haven't responded, and I'm not sure if I ever will. I've heard through family that they've moved to another state for a fresh start. Dad found a new job, and Caroline's pregnant. It's strange to think I might have a half-sibling out there someday. Part of me hopes they've learned from their mistakes and will be better parents this time around. Another part of me is angry that they get to start over while I'm still dealing with the fallout of their actions. The news of Caroline's pregnancy brought up a lot of complicated feelings. I found myself thinking about the sibling I might have had if Mom hadn't gotten sick. She and Dad had talked about having another child, but then the cancer diagnosis came, and those plans were put on hold indefinitely. Now, Dad was getting that second chance at parenthood, but with someone else. It felt unfair, like he was getting to live out the future that should have been Mom's. As for me, I'm doing better. Therapy has helped a lot. I'm starting to work through my grief over Mom and the complicated feelings about Dad. I've realized that it's okay to miss the good times with Dad while still being angry about what he did. It doesn't make me weak or a pushover. It just makes me human. I've decided to keep the house. It's full of memories, both good and bad, but it's mine. I'm slowly making it my own, filling it with new memories. I've even started gardening, something I used to do with Mom. It makes me feel close to her. Last weekend, I planted a rose bush in the backyard, Mom's favorite flower. As I was digging the hole, I found an old toy car buried in the dirt. I recognized it immediately. It was one Dad had given me for my 7th birthday. We'd spent hours playing with it in the yard that summer. Finding it brought back a flood of happy memories from before everything went wrong. For a moment, I considered calling Dad to tell him about it, but then I remembered everything that had happened, and the moment passed. My relationship with my grandparents and Mom's side of the family continues to grow stronger. We have weekly dinners, and I'm getting to know my cousins better. It's like I found the family I always needed. I'm starting a new job next month in a city about an hour away. Close enough to visit family often, but far enough to feel like I'm starting my own life. I'm nervous, but excited. The job is at a nonprofit that provides support to families dealing with cancer. It feels like a way to honor Mom's memory and turn my painful experience into something positive. I'll be working with kids who have a parent with cancer, helping them navigate the emotions and challenges I know all too well. It's not going to be easy, but I think it's important work. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had just apologized to Caroline that day, if I had tried harder to accept her. But then I remind myself that I didn't do anything wrong by having boundaries and honoring my Mom's memory. Dad and Caroline made their choices, and now we're all living with the consequences. I don't know what the future holds. Maybe someday I'll be ready to have Dad in my life again. Maybe not. For now, I'm focusing on building a life that would make Mom proud. And for the first time in a long time, I feel hopeful about the future.